further ado, I invite Ben, the leader of the first week of the affirmative to open this case.
It is completely arbitrary that we don't like talking about our salaries. But in reality, it isn't just arbitrary. This system exists to create an environment where you do not know how much the person next to you earns. This means if you're a minority, there is a significant chance you don't earn as much as the white person next to you, or you don't know how much your boss earns, like whether it be 3 times as much as 10 times. And we see on this side of the house, this increases pay gaps and stops minorities from being able to live in an equitable society. We cannot stand for this on our side of the house. What we see today's mooch, like the model is basically in the mooch, but we'd like to say that wealth is defined as your assets and tangible like assets as well on top of that. But alongside of that, like tax declarations, income, salary, the kind of things that your government already collects already, it's just like we're releasing this into a public database. So what we want to achieve here is a fairer, more equitable New Zealand where people are held to account when they do not contribute to society, and people who are not like living under a fair society can be raised up to the standards from which they should be living. Yes.
When you give all this information to big corporations, you give them huge bargaining power over employees. How does your side stop the working class from being exploited?
We see the complete opposite. We're going to talk about this in my first substantive point. So the model that we present is similar to the system we see with MPs in Parliament. What this means is, like, for example, when John Key got to Parliament, we learned that he is incredibly rich. Like, he's one of the richest people in New Zealand. Because he had to release his assets, he had to tell people how much he'd earned in the past. We see that this system is going to be exactly the same, or very, very similar. So the main stakeholder in this debate is the workers of New Zealand, who are most disadvantaged by the status quo. This could look like people who are affected by racial and gender pay gaps, or people who fall victim to skyrocketing inequalities through wealth gaps. No thank you. Who will use this system? We see that unions are going to use this system, media, think tanks, and people wanting info on how much people around them earn. There's like a small amount of people who are just going to be nosy and troll through the system anyway, but we don't see this will be an impactful group in this debate. So 2 points I will present. Firstly, why we will benefit equality among New Zealanders, and secondly, why we achieve a fair taxation system. So firstly, why we benefit equality among New Zealand workers. Outlined for this point is pay inequalities can be held accountable in New Zealand. Context is, people do not talk about their incomes, and stigma around this exists. The stigma exists because people fear that they're going to be judged by those around them for how much they earn, whether they be rich or whether they be poor. We see that this is just like a completely redundant fear on the basis that you can already see someone's material assets. Like if someone drives a very expensive car to work, you can obviously through that judge that they have a lot of material wealth, and on the opposite, if they drive like less quality car, you can see that they aren't as rich. So we see through this that people can already judge others on their wealth, on how their living standards are. So we think that the idea that introducing this data system where people can see your wealth, like actual wealth, is not going to actually have many increased harms in our side of the house. So onto my mechanisms why we benefit workers with our model. So basically it's easier to identify racial and gender pay gaps because like racism and sexism still exists in the workplace and like materialises in pay inequalities. So we see this through the fact that like women consistently earn less than men. It's something like $0.87 for every dollar that a white man earns. And this is just because we have like institutional racism in the workplace, where like a lot of employers are white males who identify with the attributes of other white males. And like as a result of that, they're more likely to give like more money to the person next to them if they identify with those attributes. We see this as completely unfair to people who come from different ethnicities or genders. We do not see that it is a fair thing to have in our society. So how do we fix this? Our comparative is people can check the incomes of co-workers around them if they suspect that others might be earning more than them. They can do this for 3 reasons. Firstly, because they know this data is accessible to them and they know that there will be wealth gaps in the workplace that are likely to exist. Secondly, they're morally right in doing so. If you identify a pay gap, you're morally right in expressing your concerns about it. And thirdly, they're protected and funded by unions. So that means if legal clashes occur, they're able to be funded by a union, and also they're protected by employment laws under the unions. That means they're not likely to be harmed by the workplace if they bring up these issues. So NEG cannot achieve this result of increasing transparency and wealth gaps in the workplace. They cannot provide any alternative system, only we can. This is like a main benefit on our side of the house. Second mechanism is also we increase collective bargaining power. Unions are better able to gain information on the pay that all of their workers receive. So this means that if one factory doing the same thing earns more than another factory doing the same thing, the workers earn different amounts, the union can use that as a bargaining power, which we see as a very effective mechanism to be able to raise the living standards of all workers under that same union. We think this is really important because it shouldn't matter what factory you work in or what workplace you work in. If you're under the same union doing the same thing as other people around you, you should earn the same fair amount as the other people. Third mechanism. We see that individual bargaining power can also be increased. If you're working in a private firm and you see that the people in the firm opposite you are earning more, what this means is that you can use that as a bargaining chip with your employer to be able to achieve a high pay for yourself. This directly correlates with the POI they stated before. What this overall means for these 2 mechanisms is that we have more incentives for people to be able to raise their incomes on a day-to-day level, which means they're going to be earning more than before, and that also means that they're more likely to be able to decrease the pay gap that currently exists in society. Why is this? Because this money is going to come out of the pockets of employers who earn 10 times more than workers for absolutely no reason, and that money just as disposable income goes into a trust which is going to earn them like bonkers amounts of money in the future. We don't see that this is a fair thing that rich people can do because it comes at the expense of people in living wage scenarios who are barely able to afford warm clothes for their children or to pay for them to go to a good school. We do not see that this is a relevant effect on their side of the house. So the outcomes of this point are we achieve greater pay equality for workers, and also we just allow unions more power to be able to progress wage inequalities. So on to the third point about second point about tax evasion. Context is most forms of tax evasion are legal. We just see that they're not good because it means that people are allowed to avoid paying their fair share to the government, which means that people in the lower class of society aren't going to benefit from welfare and the government funding that they really need to be able to live a comfortable life. What we see here is journalists can hold tax evaders to account because the public wants to know the people who are not paying tax in their society. What this means as an outcome is we create accountability because we see that journalists or whatever who incentivised to bring about the people who are obviously tax evading are more able to do that. And that means that we create a culture where people are going to hold people who don't pay enough tax to account, creating a culture where in the future people who are wealthy are less likely to tax evade, more likely to contribute the fair amount of tax they should be paying to society. What is an example of this? If you maybe don't declare all your assets, and you say that you only pay $20,000 in tax a year, but it's very clear that you own a $10 million mansion, people can very clearly see through this that you're a tax evader. It's very clear here that you have many, many assets and you're not contributing to society by paying your fair share of tax. Comparative on this side of the house is very clearly provide a mechanism where we create a culture for people to earn a lot of money, to be able to contribute back to society and to feel pressured to do so, meaning that the people who struggle in society, the people who are affected most in this debate, manage to live better lives. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was just the school bell, so don't worry. It wasn't any sort of alarm. I thank the speaker for his speech, and I invite Isaac, the first speaker of the negating team, to open his new case.
In 2021, we're moving to a New Zealand where class, where income, where wealth doesn't have a determiner on your life, on your opportunities, on your chance of success. What SciDAF want to do is take us back 100 years into a system where class does matter, where income does matter. We are so proud to oppose that on side negative. What do we support in today's debate? Two things. Firstly, no database. Secondly, we're still happy to support the IRD collecting necessary stats of income and tax payments, but not publishing it with individual names. This is just the status quo. We've got two paths to victories in today's debate. Either we can show you that this is principally unjust and should not be done on that basis, or that it creates a far more fractured society and takes us back in time to a place where we don't want to return. We're team social cohesion. We're so proud to negate this mood. Well, three substantives for the House in this speech. Firstly, why this is an unjust breach of an individual's right to privacy. Secondly, how this policy entrenches socioeconomic divides and thwarts social mobility. And thirdly, why children specifically react badly and interact badly with their policy. But before that, let's take a look at some rebuttal, much of which will be integrated. Their first key claim was that it's really easy to detect wealth and income differences under the status quo with things like clothes and cars. A couple of responses. Firstly, we just say this clashes with their case, because if they want to run that policy, then all their first material doesn't really matter that much, as you're actually able to detect all those differences in incomes, all those inequalities, so I'm not quite sure if they want to carry that team line down their bench. But secondly, we tell you the characterisation that we think that we're running with on our side of the house is that it's becoming far less true in 2021, because dress in New Zealand is relatively similar regardless of what your income is. You have lots of workplaces opting for jeans and t-shirts, dress codes. We think cars are things that a lot of people don't see because you park or you bus or ride to work. So we don't think that this is something that's totally obvious. The second key claim was that when you know other people's income within your workplace, you're able to get lots of change, and it just leads to absolute equality. Look, a couple of things. Firstly, we tell you we already know that there are huge income differences between men and women under the status quo. We already have that information published by organisations like Stats NZ. We're already getting huge social change on that basis. But secondly, we tell you if we run with their characterisation that this information is so crucial, we just doubt that they can actually do anything about it, even if you do get provided with this information, because employers are still able to make excuses or explanations of this person is earning a little bit more than you because they work a little bit longer hours, they're more productive, they're more efficient, they're the bigger part of the team, intangibles that you can't measure, that they can't measure. Their final key claim was that they can avoid tax evasion. What are our responses to this? Three. Firstly, we tell you we still have other checks and balances on our side of the house, like the IRD, to stop tax evasion. Secondly, we tell you people already know that the wealthiest people do have tax evasion. We already have journalists on the case of big, high-profile New Zealanders. We think we can still get those benefits on our side of the house. But thirdly, what they didn't engage with is this is only a New Zealand motion. So even if we assume that policy is really successful and gets this huge public outcry, what people do, the wealthy big New Zealanders that bring so much money to our economy, leave New Zealand, we lose all that money and revenue that they want if there's such a big outcry because this is only in New Zealand. Let's now take a look at our case then. Firstly, on why this is an unjust breach of an individual's right to privacy. Three reasons for this. Firstly, we tell you an individual owns their own information. They create it. The government doesn't own it. Because of this, they should be able to control the flow of the information. In some cases, this means it's not to the public, in cases like salary and income, but in some cases like wealth, which we already don't publish to the government, we don't think that the government needs to know that. They're able to control the flow of that information. Secondly, we tell you this is unjust because there's no context to the information that's being provided. Because if you're a low-income mum or a person who had a terminal illness or had their family that faced discrimination, their policy doesn't give any context to what's happened to why that income is that way. That's so crucial because they don't support full exposure, they support semi-exposure, which leads to a whole lot of problems. Thirdly, we tell you individuals have already made decisions in the last 50 years of their life on the basis that they will be able to retain this right to privacy. This is really crucial because we recognise that a fundamental principle of law is that laws shouldn't be applied retrospectively, but this is effectively being applied retrospectively on the basis of their last 50 years' decisions. This looks like a middle income earner having chosen for the last 50 years to save heaps and put lots of money into personal wealth, as they don't think this will affect the perception of others, how others perceive them. When their policy changes this, they're not given a chance to change this life decisions, they're being punished for something retrospectively. Clearly, this policy is principally unjustified. But quickly, if they're going to respond and say, why should we still give tax receipts to the IRD? Why is that different? Couple of reasons. Firstly, we say it's very clear legal purpose in that you're actually paying tax. That's like a super clear purpose. Secondly, we tell you it's inherently different because your information is not given to the public. I'll take a POI if you've got one.
Why is it fair that a wealthy employer should earn more of the expensive tax would be able to earn minimum wage?
Look, I just gave you heaps of information about that, but that leads me in my rebuttal. But that leads me on to the second point about how your policy entrenches socioeconomic divides and thwarts social mobility. 4 things under this. Firstly, on bargaining power, which directly responds to their mechanism, we tell you this reduces the bargaining power of low-income workers. Because when you're on a minimum wage and your employer can clearly see that, what that means is that when you go to the next employer, you're not able to ask for more or say that you're a really good worker or try and show that you're really impressive in the interview to get another $5. Because they're able to see you're on minimum wage, you don't have anything better to do, we're going to keep you on that. Secondly, we tell you organisations make assumptions about you based on this information under their side of the house. Because if you're really rich, an employer is likely, or have lots of personal wealth, an employer is more likely to hire you under your side of the house, as you have that perception of all rich people being really smart. The comparative is true and just as harmful. Thirdly, we tell you forming connections with people outside of your socioeconomic group is harder. Because business connections or even friendships and romantic connections are a lot harder when you create this huge divide between people in society. When you say that because this person is a little bit wealthier, you're less likely to engage with them, that's a really tangible difference under their side of the house. But fourthly, we tell you their policy fuels negative right-wing rhetoric targeted at low socioeconomic groups and minorities. Because when someone like Don Brash is able to say, go to this database and search up a Pakeha name and a Māori name and see the difference in income, we think that's really, really harmful and produces a lot of harms to Māori and how the rest of society perceives them. This is so harmful because we think that reduces social mobility and prevents people improving their living standards or getting or not staying financially oppressed, but it also threatens social cohesion as it creates class barriers. Finally, as an end up to that point, let's look at specifically how children interact with this. Crucially, their policy gives no context to any of the situations that these families are facing. And it's hard. And so what we tell you is, firstly, their friendships that they're going to form are going to be affected by this information because they're really easily able to go home and search up the incomes of different people and say that because we've got this commonality, it's more likely that I'm going to be friends with this other rich kid or this other poor kid, and that because of that division. But secondly, in the most extreme cases, it looks like kids bullying each other based on their family's wealth. Because they're insensitive, a lot of kids, to sensitivities like wealth. They have no context to their mum having a terminal illness. This is so harmful because it creates pernicious mental health problems when that side of the house creates school guards that are divided based on wealth. We support a system where we have social equality. We're getting there on side neck. So proud to oppose.
Panel, NZIER is utterly treated if they believe that class doesn't matter, in today's world, when there are people who are literally struggling to pay their rent, to have heaters that stop black mold growing in their house, to put food on their table and shoes on their kids' feet, and yet other people are buying 5 Ferraris and 2 private jets in the same country. And the problem for them is that they've based their whole case of saying that there is no class divide in New Zealand and you can't see that, which unfortunately is not true, and that's why they can never win. 4 things to do in my speech today. Firstly, talk to you about how you can detect class. Secondly, talk to you about tax evasion. Thirdly, on privacy. And fourthly, on pay inequality, with which my split will be included. So firstly then, on detecting class, because we tell you that class is quite visible in New Zealand society. We've already given you examples in my introduction of why that's clear. We tell you that what we do on our side is create the ability to see what someone's wage is, and that is especially important. They tell you that that's a contention, because they're collating the same, like wage and class. But that's not true, because if you are a worker in a firm, you know that the person who's working with you on a similar job is probably earning a similar amount, so you appear to have the same class, but they might be earning 5 or 10k more a year, which isn't enough to create like a class difference and allow them to buy a private jet, but it is enough for them to be able to pay a bit more, like maybe rent a better apartment, so they are more materially well off, buy better food or like better books for their kids. So it still creates a divide, it still creates an inequality. That's why that's some contention in our case, and that's why it's really important. So basically, NED gave us no reasons why there is no class divide in New Zealand. They just said it's true. That is completely false and an entire assertion. It's really obvious that there is a class divide. I've given you so many examples of that. So then they decided to go off by telling you that it creates social division when we introduce class by publishing wages. But I've already told you that that's not true because we already have class. So all their harms there about creating social division simply never stand in this debate. They also tell us that it will fuel right-wing rhetoric because Don Brash can point out that Māori people don't earn as much as Pākehā because of their race. But we think that's already clear because of their poverty. But what you can do on our side is say, look, Māori are learning less because of their race. That's really, really bad. Let's talk to their employers. Let's empower our unions to fight for our Māori people to earn more. So we get a benefit on our side because of that. And finally, they had this harm about children bullying each other in the playground. Firstly, again, children already know about class because it already exists. But secondly, kids are going to look up on the IRD database to check what their other 6-year-old classmates' family's wealth is. That's just ridiculous. Okay, so let's then talk about privacy. So they told us, a lot of their stuff is already about how it exposes families for class divide and you don't know the circumstances, but I've already disproved that again because you can already tell. Secondly, people base their decisions off the ability of having privacy in the future. Firstly, we tell you again because you already see class people already do that, but also why is it bad to be rich? If you've got a Ferrari, that's not that embarrassing. You can drive around in your Ferrari. We don't see a harm in that in this case because you're really well off materially, so we don't see how there's actually any tangible harm to rich people. And even if there is a harm to them, that's so minor in this debate compared to the very lives of low-paid workers and their ability to actually gain a good income and feed their children. So that's really unimportant in this debate as well. Okay. So let's then talk about tax evasion, because we tell you that when we have these databases available, media, journalists are incentivized to seek out, maybe a Fonterra executive who isn't paying their taxes and clearly has quite a lot of assets, because that is a really high impact story that they can then earn a lot off of, because people will be really shocked about this. We also tell you that people really, really care about this because they, most workers, pay their fair share of tax, especially the lower income workers. So when they are paying their fair share of tax, taking money out of their own income that they could be feeding their kids, then they feel extremely irate at these very rich people in society who are earning millions and millions of dollars a year and are not only paying $5,000 in tax. They feel so angry about that because they feel like they are not benefiting off, rich people are ripping them off while they are paying for their own welfare, which is not how wealth distribution in New Zealand should work as the tax system does. So we think that when we create the awareness even more of tax evasion through these corporates, because we're actually able to materially say exactly where the tax evasion is happening and how much the scale of it, people are going to become really, really angry about that. Therefore, pressure those corporations, pressure Fonterra, boycott Fonterra until the executive pays their amount. So what they told us in response is that the IRD already says this, but we think we open that up to the public on an accessible level, so it's way more of an impact journalists can look at, way more available. And secondly, they said that rich people are going to leave New Zealand. But firstly, we tell you, there's probably already a giant trend of rich people coming to New Zealand because they see it as a safe haven in, a time of global turmoil. They think that it is, generally quite a safe place to raise kids, etc. But they also have connections here. They've got business connections. Their literal company is set up here. Frontier executives aren't going to just move overseas to, Australia because literally all the cows that they make money off are from here. The whole company, you can't just move your entire company a lot of the times. We think that harm is really, really small. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's lean to
When you're super qualified and have been an executive of a company, and there are a lot of other dairy companies around the world, why wouldn't you move to a place where there's not this policy if there's going to be such a big public outcry?
I've already told you why. It's because you have connections to New Zealand, you have connections to the other executives there, you have a well-built thing. I've already responded to that. So then let's talk about pay inequality. My split is going to be included within this point. Because we tell you that we firstly stop the racial and gender pay gap when workers themselves are actively able to see that they have a pay gap between their other employee who is a white male and they are a woman of colour. They see, look, my other employee is earning 20% more than I am. That's really bad. I'm going to directly lobby my employer. They say that they have it as well on their side because there's aggregate data about racial inequalities in the workplace in New Zealand. We say, yes, you do, but if you can't take that as an individual employee to lobby your employer because you can't concretely prove that it's true in your case. Whereas on our side, you actively can because you can say, this is very true that I have less money than my other employee. Fix that. It's illegal. So then you can then lobby your employer to do that. So we do it better on our side. We also told you about union power, the ability to lobby better for their workers if unions have greater information and also individual bargaining, offering I'm going from one company to another as I feel like we're not getting paid enough. No response to any of that. Those are still very strong mechanisms for why we get better equality that are not addressed on the other side of the house. And the only response here is that people will make assumptions based on people's, employers will, when hiring people, make assumptions based on the amount that they earned in the past. We tell you that qualifications are way more important in this sense. If they see that someone earned a bit more in the past but has way less qualifications than another worker who earned less in the past but has all these amazing things that perfectly fit the job, of course that is going to be way more important. We think the harm there is really, really low because most of the time qualification is so much more important. The ability to fulfill the job is way more important. We also tell you that we decrease pay inequality because we get better economic policy, and this is my split. So we tell you that right now the government only gets quarterly updates from the IRD to the Treasury, so it's really hard to know how the economic policy is playing out. Two mechanisms. Firstly, the government gets more information, so they have a constant real-time ability to tell how the economic policy is playing out and tweak that to work best for New Zealanders. But secondly, we think that it empowers economic think tanks like the NZIER to be able to create good economic policy, let the public know about what's happening, so that they can then help scrutinise the government, ask the government what's happening there, and educate the public over what's happening. So we think we get better policy because the government has more information, better scrutiny because of great institutions who can educate the public. We think that is better for all New Zealanders because we're getting better economic policy that can then better lift them up from intergenerational poverty, allow them better benefits, that kind of thing. So at the end of our case, we get greater power for workers to bargain for pay that suits them. We get greater power for to stop tax evasion and allow all New Zealanders to benefit from our benefit system. That's why we're so proud to stand.
I think the speaker will have speech, and I invite the second engaging speaker.
Has given us 16 minutes of substantive, and we still don't have a clear picture as to why people in society having information actually get more change, actually get systematic changes that journalists couldn't do in the past, that all the databases, all the politics, and the government couldn't do in the past. They need to prove this to us in the speech. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why this policy actually entrenches inequality and reduces bargaining power for the most vulnerable. Secondly, the principal right to privacy, which went critically unresponded to by the affirmative team. And finally, I'll bring you a split point about why this database will actually help most the corrupt are companies and corporations that exploit vulnerable minorities. But before I go on, I'm going to address the points that went completely unresponded to by the affirmative team. Firstly, Isaac got to a lot of points about a lot of rich people actually just leaving New Zealand and forfeiting their residency, and we said that this would actually have a huge deal of harm because these people are the people who bring money into the country. When they have to do this, when they're being judged on issues such as this, you actually have a lot of harm to the New Zealand economy, and these people leaving are the people paying the taxes that actually go into the welfare programs that the affirmative team wants so badly. Secondly, they didn't address the point that Isaac had about how this affects the generational relationships that are created because of people not having enough context and actually judging other people based on this base value numerical information. They didn't actually tell us why, and this is incredibly important because when people when these younger generational relationships are broken, this creates more classism in society in the long term. This creates a huge harm in society, and this wasn't responded to. Okay, moving on to why this policy actually entrenches inequality. Affirmative firstly came out and said that information like this is already given to the government. This is just making it public, and this is going to have huge change because people can hold others accountable. We asked them why the government is in a worse place to do this when they have all the support, when they have an incentive to reduce inequality. Why are suddenly people going to know this information, going to create this huge harm? We just don't think that this is very likely, but we think it's actually more likely, and what we're pushing is going to happen is that people are just going to be using this information to create value judgments and make biased decisions about people. This looks like universities not actually taking people on a lower income because they don't think that they can donate as much to the university in the future. We think that this looks like people not hiring people based off this because they make value judgments. This all came out at Isaac and it went critically unresponded to. The key difference is also that we actually have governments and we have journalists that bring this information. We all know key wealth statistics, and this is debated in society a lot. The context is actually given here because journalists are able to put this information into context. However, on this database, all you have to do is put a filter in, put the wealth bracket that you want to have a look at, and there's absolutely no context and just a bunch of names. This pushes right-wing rhetoric and this pushes hateful comments towards certain individuals in society. We just don't think that this is going to be better than what we already have. Secondly, the affirmative also told us that it was really easy to detect inequality because people are driving around in Ferraris. We tell you that firstly, this is kind of a premise that in New Zealand especially, this is kind of harder to do because a lot of people might put an image forward that they drive a Ferrari, but however, just as many rich people don't do this. So when you can actually create relationships with these people and engage with these people, this wealth doesn't matter as much because when you have a clear relationship with these people, even if they do have a nicer house than you, it doesn't matter as much. What this actually creates, so the inherent harms there are, is that in this, if this policy gets through, you see the wealth of the person before you see the person, you see the clear numbers, they earn more than me before you actually understand who this person is. Secondly, they said that they have better bargaining. Thirdly, they said they have better bargaining power because they have more collective power in unions. However, we tell you that unions already have a lot of information, and they're also able to be targeted towards information that's actually beneficial to them. Female workers who are part of a union actually have clear statistics on why female workers actually get paid less, and this is really beneficial to the union itself to work together. Whereas on their side of the house, they don't have bargaining power because the corporations already know that they can't make rent this week and they can't actually budge that much out of their jobs. However, there's a huge amount of resentment and there's nothing they can do about it. They don't really show us why we get social changes. However, it also hurts a lot of minorities because of this right-wing rhetoric, and the bargaining power isn't going to help them here because when the society stands against them and there's a lot of political capital against them, this isn't actually going to be beneficial for any bargaining power they might have, and these stereotypes might hurt them further. Finally, they said that people can hold others accountable on tax and things like this. They said but this kind of contradicts some things that they said in their case because initially at first they told us there will be companies and universities who have huge resources, but suddenly they want to say that everyone will become journalists, everyone will become social activists, and they're going to hold everyone accountable for tax. We just don't think that this is very viable.
How do you uplift the thousands of children who live in poverty in the States?
We tell you that we already have people in the government who are focused on issues like inequality. We don't think that this is really in the scope of the debate. When you have a huge loss of bargaining power for the most vulnerable in society, we don't think that this is actually going to win them the debate. Secondly, briefly, because also unresponded to, we have the principle of privacy. Second affirmative speaker came out and told us that because it's outweighed by like the harms of like the poor people and social equality which they're going to solve, that this principle doesn't matter. Why do we tell you that this principle actually does matter and is debate winning? Firstly, you can't punish people and you can't bring in legislation that punishes people for their past decisions when these decisions were made based off the understanding that their rights were going to actually be respected and conserved. However, this also has no, the examples that they put here were really bad because they said Ferraris, they don't care, there's no judgment around this, and this is already public information anyway. We tell you that these sorts of shows of wealth are their own choice. However, it's not the government's, it's not within the government's rights to actually go ahead and take information about these people and put it out there when there's no context. There was absolutely no engagement with this either. Secondly, there's a lot of the context point is really big because when people want to show parts of themselves, they can. However, the government has actually published this information without any context, only in numerical figures, and this highlights how different people just have different priorities. Some people might have just pursued wealth because they wanted to, and some people didn't. We think that without this context, you can't understand why some people pursued their wealth, and this just creates a bad narrative of them. We don't think that this is principally correct. Finally, I'm going to move on to why this database will actually help corporations exploit vulnerable societies. Firstly, let's look at the premise where companies already have a huge appetite for information like this because it hugely increases their advertising power, it hugely increases the profit margins they're going to actually be making. This actually this database is going to help them hugely because what they can do is they can set a filter on the searchable database, look at the people they want to target, they have their names on it, go on social media, and find out all this information. We think that this is incredibly harmful for 4 million reasons. Firstly, it's the most vulnerable of the poor because they don't have as much information about saving, and this advertising hurts them the most. But secondly, when these poor people are targeted by these companies, the advertising becomes catered towards these people. They can go onto their Instagram and search what they what their tastes are, and this is really harmful to these people because they're going to be exploited constantly. Also, companies can go on this database and find people who make bad decisions and have a big consumption, and this shows them further who they can target. And also often just how this database also negatively impacts companies and gives them more power is that corporations are also just going to have a lot more lobbying power if this goes through because they can look at politicians who are struggling financially and just target them greater. This is hugely beneficial. At the end of this point, the policy singles out the most vulnerable in society as side affirmative is thrown to corporations and works into the prejudices of the people proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for this speech. I invite Tony, who is the third attendant, to conclude the substantive portion of this debate.
Oh no. Just roll on that. Oh, it's fine, mate. Oh, good bro.
NZIER simply cannot say that we are moving towards a post-class society when we live in a society where child poverty rates are going down slower than the salaries of our richest CEOs. They simply cannot say that. Look, the only reason we can conflate a right to privacy with sharing income is because of this social taboo. The taboo that exists because employees in the 1800s wanted to be able to send 8-year-olds into the mercury mines for 20 cents an hour. Look, you know what? I'm going to disclose my income right now because I'm built different. Current job, I get paid $20.50 an hour with a 13% tax rate. Past job, I got paid $15 an hour, but no tax because they paid me in cash. And my wealth is 85 cents in my savings account, right? And what does that change about your perception of me? Very little. What do you know about me that you didn't already know from the fact that I'm wearing an $80 suit right now? The fact of the matter is, all of the inequalities which currently exist are already highly visible. All that happens when you restrict people's ability to see how much their boss earns, how much their co-workers earns, is you fundamentally reduce the ability of them to fight for their own rights, to fight for their own working rights, and to fight for the ability to lift themselves and their families out of of intergenerational poverty. 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, on the visibility of inequality. Secondly, on the impacts on working power. And lastly, on how this impacts rich people, I guess. Firstly, let's look at how the visibility of inequality. So they say that there was a section of their case. This doesn't actually engage with what we were saying. The fact is, currently, you know how much, you know the social classes of the people around you, right? There are so many ways to see this. It's not, they've characterized this as only being able to tell because of the car they drive. There are so many factors. You can look at the decile schools the kids go to. You can look at the neighborhood they live in, whether they live in Ponsonby or South Auckland. You can look at the way they dress, not just the way they dress, but their backgrounds. You can look at even the jobs they work. Even if you don't know exact figures, you can probably guess that a programmer earns more than someone who works in hospitality. There are so many factors in society that you can use to determine someone's class, literally just what their house looks like. Again, this is information that you can just find in Google Earth anyways. We think that they're fundamentally disengaged with what we're actually saying. The difference under our model is that you can see the extent to which inequality exists. You can see whether your boss makes 50% more than you, or if your boss makes 10 times your salary. You can see how much the CEO of your company makes while you're slaving away for $20 an hour. These are the things that you can uniquely see when you know exact details. Look, all of the harms about knowing about other people's class exist already when you broadly know people's class, when you broadly know the neighborhoods they live in, you broadly know the jobs they work. All of the benefits that we get exist when you know exactly a numerical figure for how rich your boss is and how much they're screwing you. Secondly, they talk about how there wouldn't be how there's no context to this data. Firstly, that just doesn't engage with reality, right? Look, what sort of nerd is spending their Friday nights looking at an IRD spreadsheet, right? The people who are actually going to be looking through this information are people who have a good reason to. It's going to be people like journalists who are looking to report on inequality. It's going to be people like academics looking to research the extent to which wage gaps exist in society. It's going to be public policy think tanks like the NZIER who are trying to do more of their amazing work in the economic research. Look, the thing is the people who are we don't think it's realistic that most people actually care enough about how much their neighbours earn, and if someone really cares enough to look at how much everyone else on their street makes, then they probably don't have, they have a pretty sad life anyways, and if that brings them some small morsel of happiness, that's still a benefit we can claim, right? It doesn't really tangibly impact the lives of anyone else in the neighbourhood, it just makes them a bit happier. That's fine, we accept that. But then let's look at, all of this analysis also applies to kids, right? Because kids can still see inequality, and kids, what sort of kid is going to go on an Excel spreadsheet to look at inequality, right? When I was a kid, I couldn't even figure out how to download Minecraft. We don't think that most kids are actually going to be able to conceptualize this information. But secondly, the comparative is that they look at who in their class is showing up to school without wearing shoes. They're looking at who in their class shows up with an empty lunchbox. Those are things which exist in the status quo and can only change when you give workers the ability to fight for their rights. This is why the fact that they are not engaging with not only what reality looks like, but also what our case looks like is why they can't win this debate. So this flows on to the impacts on workers, right? So, again, we fundamentally reject the fact that we're moving towards a post-class society, right? We actually see that inequality is growing bigger, especially after COVID. You see that the salaries of the wealthy are getting bigger, while people on the bottom are stagnating. We think that inequality is actually increasing, and the only way to fix that is when we're aware to the extent that inequality manifests in our society. So why we get better bargaining power? We gave you a lot of mechanisms at first that weren't really responding to. Again, firstly, you can directly compare your co-workers. Know that this is distinct from being broadly aware that a wage gap exists. Because instead of knowing that there was a broad wage gap that you may or may not fall victim to, you know that you earn 15% less than your male co-worker for the same job, and because of your co-worker, you know for a fact that you work just as hard as them. You know for a fact that you're just experienced as them. You know about your co-worker, so you know that there is nothing that means that they should earn more than you. That is the difference in our case. This is why it is different from just broadly knowing that inequalities may or may not exist. Secondly, this makes it harder to justify because, again, you have access to all this information. Secondly, this leads to collective bargaining. They see that unions already have this information. No, they don't. Firstly, because of the shrinking power of unions, a lot of unions don't have cross-sector representation. It means they maybe have 10 to 20% of workers in the sector. That's not enough information. Going further than that, a lot of workers, because of these arbitrary societal taboos, do not want to tell their incomes even to their own unions, which means that the actual amount of data that unions have to play with is very limited. And if we can, increase the amount of data they have access to by 10 times, that is a benefit. That makes it much easier for unions to say that this is a factory that pays women less, this is a factory that pays morally less, or that this is a factory that underpays its workers relative to every other factory, and their CEO earns 10 times more. That is something that unions can see, that is something that journalists can see, that is something that they can take concrete action on. We have heard no engagement to this from the opposition side. They said something about Then they talked about how employers making value judgments. That was their only response, right? That employers wouldn't want to hire you because you work a minimum wage job. Firstly, I'm just going to talk about the fundamental asymmetry in information that exists, right? An employer firstly knows how much they're paying, so they know how much is like a fair pay for the sector. But also, like, employers talk to each other, right? Like McDonald's probably, like the people who run McDonald's probably know how much Burger King's paying. The people who own one factory are probably mates with the people who run the factory across the road. They know, and also like the fact that they're in an industry and they have a high position, it means they know their industry well. They know what's a fair rate. Workers don't, because workers don't know how much their boss is earning. Workers don't know how much the people in the factory across the world, across the street are earning. This is the fundamental information asymmetry that NZIER failed to engage with. Yeah, go on.
All of your stats, like headline stats about differences between top income and frontier and low minimum wage workers, we already know and are so publicised in the media. How do you get any change?
Okay, sure, maybe we know about the CEO and Frontier, we don't know about the middle management. We don't know, firstly, Frontier is an outlier because Frontier has an unusually high profile. We don't, like, most people don't know that how much, like, most CEOs and most business owners off the top of their head, it's not reported on. It's just very difficult to find out, and it's easier under our side. But also, like, even then, like, even if it's your manager who makes twice as much as you, that is still valuable. That's still a benefit thing. So at the end, it's actually clear that we are the only side of the house which increases the power of workers and organised labour to fight for their rights, increasing their wages, increasing equality, increasing long-term economic and social development. Lastly, on rich people. Look, they said rich people will leave. Several reasons they don't. First, New Zealand is desirable. That is why people like Peter Thiel are moving in here. Secondly, like, it's not like they're just going to leave their families and friends behind. If they've like lived here for like 50 years, they're not just going to bail on their families, bail on their friends, bail on everything they know, just because other people know how much money they make. But for the people who actually do that, right, they probably do that because they have something to hide. They do that because they have been evading taxes, and honestly, if they've been evading taxes, it's completely irrelevant whether or not they did it because they thought they wouldn't get caught. We think it is wrong, and if they want to, like, go off to Australia, that's fine, it's their problem now. Look, we think at the end of this debate, we are the only side of the house, and look, at the end of this debate, we are weighing, like, a marginal right to privacy from, like, a Western, like, perspective, if you consider, like knowing the extent to which inequalities exist as, like, a privacy issue, but we can get tangible increases to the most vulnerable workers in our society. Thank you.
Panel, our burden in today's debate was never to prove that we are going to solve all inequalities in the world. Our burden, as we told you in today's debate, right from first, and as we continue right down the line, was to prove that either this was a huge impediment on people's privacy on a principal basis, or that it worsened social inequalities and it created a deeply entrenched divide in social classes. Not only have we proven that, but in their material they have failed to actually push how they get a change in policy. They have failed to impact how their push, how their public outcry actually gets changed. We have given you structural mechanisms on how that public outcry is actually harmful to their case. We therefore win today's debate. 2 points of clash and 1 point of context to start this debate. Firstly, the point of context on what does this information look like, and then 2 points of clash on why we principally should uphold the right to privacy, and then secondly, how this entrenches social inequality. So firstly, what does this information look like? So there was like this big argument in this debate over whether you can see wealth and the extent to which you can see it under the status quo. They said that you can see poverty, you can see inequality, all of those things, right? We think they're two responses here. Firstly, it was never our case that it was impossible to detect poverty, it was impossible to detect inequality. We think that we can see those things and therefore we can work to rectify those things. We think they are bludgeoningly obvious. But we think what they do is they make it obvious to the point where like it actually impedes on people's privacy and impedes on people's will, and they put their name in it as well, which really impedes on their privacy. But secondly, we think that on our side of the house, you have the option to be private if you want, right? Just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you have to buy a wealthy house, a rich car. If you want to be a private person, if you don't want to show your wealth, you can dress down, you can drive just like a normal car and live in a normal house. We think this is an option we have on our side of the house that they don't, right? Where they make it so obvious who has this wealth, who has this money. That is what the information looks like in today's debate. Right, now that I've clarified that, 2 points of clash in today's debate. Firstly, why we are principally justified in doing this. So, why should the right to privacy be protected, right? We gave you 3 reasons right from first. We told you firstly that people own their own information, not the government. This is really important because we think people should have the ability to withhold information and be able to have private information, because if they have to leak constant information, they are going to feel that's going to have a huge detriment on their well-being when they are leaking this kind of information, when they have to give up information. We think privacy makes people feel comfortable. We think that's something really important. Secondly, we think there's no context to this information, right? It doesn't actually explain like how that wealth accrued, how those like inequalities accrued, why you are in the situation you are in. We think that makes it really damaging. But thirdly, we think individuals have already made decisions in the last like 50 years on the basis that the right to privacy will be protected. We think that you don't actually make like policy you don't make law retrospectively. That's what their side of the house wants to do. That's really harmful in today's debate. We heard an insufficient response on this principle. Why is this so important? 2 reasons. Firstly, the government needs to consider principles when making policy, right? We don't think that the government can just look at like the practical outcomes. The job of the government is to consider whether things are principally justified, whether they are principally right in doing this. We think this is a huge thing that they need to consider. When we are having a government debate, a principle is a crucial point they didn't want to contend. Secondly, we think public backlash is absolutely huge on the government, and this is a more practical outcome of this principle, but we think that like when you actually implement this kind of policy, the government is going to face so much public backlash, and it's going to mean the policy cannot run efficiently, it's really hated, and you get a whole bunch of outrage at the government. We think at the end of this point, we can clearly see that not only does this principle stand on its own in today's debate, but we have clearly won it, and it is clearly debate-winning material because we actually uphold a really fundamental right that is really important in our society. Now moving on to the second point of class on how we entrench social inequality begins.
When the right to privacy for the rich clashes with the right for workers to know they're being discriminated against, why should
Okay, I'm just going to stop you there. We actually, I think workers can know if they're on low incomes and people are on high incomes. Those stats are already out there. We also think that it's really easy for them to be explained away, as I'll go on to in this point. So they wanted to talk about tax evasion, and they told us up front about this. Isaac then gave you 3 great responses, and they really just said that they get more engagement and public outcry. 2 responses to this. Firstly, people already know about this, right? They don't actually care that much about it, particularly when it's a big company like Fonterra that they go to, that they're already comfortable buying their products from. They're probably not going to make that switch for something they already probably knew was happening. But secondly, there's just not much they can do even if they do care, right? They wanted to talk about boycotts, but when you have fundamentally huge corporations in New Zealand that are critical to our economy, you are unlikely to be able to actually pressure them out, right? Look at companies like Nike and Amazon. We know they are terrible for society. We know they do horrible things, yet they're still 2 of the biggest companies in the world. Clearly the social pressure doesn't work. They haven't stepped us through how the social pressure actually makes a change, which makes this material so crucial. They then said that people won't leave the countries, these high flyers who contribute to the economy won't leave the countries due to business connections. 4 responses to this. Firstly, if they're top executives, they probably have connections in other countries already. They probably have those networks. They've probably been headhunted before in other countries, and so they are able to do this. Secondly, we think there's probably higher pay in a lot of cases overseas, and the reason they stay in New Zealand under the status quo is because they like New Zealand and it might be a safe haven. But when you put in this policy, when you create this fundamental change which they disagree with, that opportunity of higher pay, of better living standards, sounds better to them, and they want to move overseas overseas, they make that calculus and they decide it's a good move to go overseas. Thirdly, we think that they can probably stay with their business like pretty easily, right? They can revoke their residency, they can move to Australia and have their business functioning as a multinational corporation, right? So they can still have all these business activities without actually having to give up the information. This is so crucial because they don't get these same contributions from these people spending in the New Zealand economy, but they still don't get rid of these people, they still don't stop these people from having this harmful information. But fourth, we think that they tried to say they won't leave, but they will leave if they're under threat of being exposed for tax evasion, right? Like, this was pretty obvious. If their back is against the wall, they're probably going to want to leave. They then told us about bargaining. They had two claims on this. Firstly, on collective bargaining and trade unions. Three responses. Firstly, they already have lots of this information. They tried to say that they didn't, but then they brought us loads of examples of stacks that we have under the status quo, clearly proving that they did have lots of this information. Secondly, we think that all the big stats they use as examples are already published, but thirdly, even if it's not true, they create more hostility between the employer and the employee, which makes individual bargaining much more harmful, which makes getting change much more harmful. Then on individuals, they said that they can point to examples of other workers getting paid more to increase their pay. What do we tell you? Two responses. Firstly, it's easy to explain away. They work harder than you. It's really hard for someone to justify, I'm more productive than that person, because the employer can just say, no, you're not, and you can't really argue with that. Secondly, look at the comparative, right? Because when you're on a minimum wage job and you're unemployed, that corporation has so much power over you because they know that if they offer you this job at minimum wage, you kind of have to take it, otherwise you can't feed your family. You can't afford those things. You really need that job. The corporation knows that now. They have all this power in this debate. We actually also have policies on our side of the house. We continue to push these policies. We've just seen Labour put in a budget which has huge spending on our Māori community, on our Māori people. We don't think that this stood. At the end of today's debate, the impact here is that they do not actually get any benefits. They haven't stepped us through anything. There's been vague talk about public outcry. We did not hear it.
Excellent. I think the speaker for the speech, and as is traditional, we reverse the speaker's order. And so I invite the leader of the engagement either to the speaker or to the reply.
SIDAF have lost today's debate because they failed to answer key questions. Firstly, they haven't been able to tell us why we shouldn't consider a so important principle in such a big government policy change. Secondly, they failed to tell us why publishing this information doesn't create far more socioeconomic divides when it's so visible for a lot of people. And thirdly, they failed to tell us why this doesn't fuel negative rhetoric targeting those who are most vulnerable, those minorities in society. We've heard a lack of response from that side of the house. That's why we take the debate. Three questions. Firstly, what are the structural differences between the two worlds? Secondly, on the right to privacy. And thirdly, which side gets better socioeconomic divides and cohesion? Firstly then, on the structural differences between the two worlds, because our case has been very clear down the line. We've said that, okay, there might be differences in your housing, but what we get in 2021 is visible class divides when you're interacting with a lot of people and having conversations with employers aren't that obvious. That was our key contention down the line. They didn't engage with it. What did they say? They said things like, collective bargaining can only happen under their side of the house. We tell you that unions mostly operate in government industries. If that's the case, Official Information Act can provide a lot of that information. But secondly, we tell you unions already collate a lot of this information that these unions have. They secondly told us that top CEOs and bottom minimum wage workers have all of this information only under their side of the house. What did we tell you at a POI? We said it's already publicised. What did we hear from them? We heard the biggest concession on that bench when they said, okay, so maybe it's only about middle management versus below and out. That reduces all of their benefits to such a big extent. all of this context is really important because it shapes how we should look at the socioeconomic divides point. Because, crucially, all of their points were contingent on them getting this greater bargaining power. You see other people get paid more and you get change, or on a union level, you're able to get far more change. But given that we've given you extensive analysis about why this information is already available in a lot of these cases on an aggregated level, that is so important. They haven't explained why you specifically need a name attached to something to be able to have such a big impact. But we've also told you, in relation to the individual bargaining power point, that if these people have such low bargaining power already, that they're already being underpaid, they haven't said why they suddenly get this huge ascendancy over their employer and that bargaining power completely changes. We've also told you about the ability of employers to make excuses and how their policy actually creates far more hostility between employers if they're just constantly going to the press, if we take their characterisation that this info is only available under their side of the house. But what did we tell you in regards to socioeconomic divides and cohesion? We gave you multiple lines of analysis, many of which have had an insufficient response from that side of the house. We've told you about how it reduces bargaining power of low-income workers because they're trapped on the income that they started with. We've told you about how organisations make assumptions and judge people based on this impact. There's stuff about the quality of the house you have doesn't factor in when you're having a conversation with your employer. We've also told you about how it impacts the connections that you have with people on the outside. The only response to this was that, children don't really care, to our analysis about children. This is so ridiculous because children are really technologically literate. Their database will need to be accessible if they want to get any change, but also children are just curious. It's something they're likely to search up. So they didn't respond sufficiently to our children point. But so, given that we improve socioeconomic divides because of their lack of response, where do we really push out the margin in this debate? We push out the margin on this privacy material because what we've said down the line is that they are unable to actually justify why we should have this breach of privacy. We gave you multiple mechanisms. I just wanted to address, it looked like they had a gotcha moment on the bench in a POI to Jack, but we tell you that the differences between income that we sort of vaguely know are not the same in today's debate because that's not being published to everyone in society. It's a completely different case when you know it just within your firm. This is debate winning because governments should make decisions based on principle when it's such a big change and because of the scale of public backlash and outcry that they get. So proud to support cohesion, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for this speech, and I invite you, the leader of the team, to deliver the last speech of the new time of 1579.
When people realised that Fonterra executives earned millions while dairy farms across the country were struggling and failing and going into liquidation, this caused backlash, making it way harder to get those planned executive raises that were going to happen in the Fonterra Corporation. This is what we get: accountability and justice. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, talk about the tangible difference between these two worlds. Secondly, talk about why they lose this debate. Then go on our path to victory, how we win in 2 different ways. So let's talk about the difference now. We have proved consistently through our entire case right on the bench that class existence in New Zealand is clear. We've told you enough about the inequalities that are very, very obvious when some people go to school without shoes and other people have mansions. It's obvious, right? So we don't change much of the perception of class when it comes to people because it's already obvious the kind of vague bracket they're in because we already exist, and it's also we tell you that there's not going to be that much of a difference because not the average everyday person doesn't really going to go on this network, this database at all anyway, so we don't think it's going to change that much. Whereas what we actually do change is that it's really clear to journalists and workers, and we've got more availability of data to unions instead of it just being in the hands of the government, which is not always effective at distributing the welfare that we need and actually making the change in inequality. That's clear because it still exists in the status quo despite the government knowing about this, so they're clearly not good enough at changing inequality, which is what we wanted to say. So how does loose because a lot of their harms were contingent on proving that class is like basically invisible, and we increase that kind of class visibility. But they fundamentally fail to do this, so all their material falls down. All the stuff about increasing, like creating right-wing showing racial inequality, that already exists on both sides, but we improve that by showing that it's because of racist employers that it exists in the first place, so you can fight for a change on that. The idea of no context on wealth, so people bullying people for being poor, again, that already exists. And the idea of bullying children in the playground, which is one of their major harms for some reason, we don't think it's really real in the first place, but it still exists on both sides. But so the other content that they give us is like this principal point on privacy, which I really wanted to tell you is really, really important. But the only thing that stands when we get rid of all the stuff that's contingent on proving that class doesn't exist is like people make decisions based on the ability to have privacy in the future. And the only example they give us is a rich person deciding to save up more money to be rich in their retirement. How is this important in the debate? We're weighing that against the very ability of workers to push for greater wages to send their kids to school with shoes on their feet and food in their belly. We do not want to weigh that at all. We fundamentally reject that as a path to victory because it is so unimportant. It doesn't matter. Secondly, they try to worsen social inequality, but as I've already told you, all their points fall. Apart from this second next split about advertising, but again, our material implicitly responds to the point we tell you that this class is already obvious. Like, companies already can go on Google and find stats and already target South Auckland and Puridoa as places to target the advertising, so we think that that doesn't change on our side. They're just pointing out a problem that exists, but not change, like talking about whether they make it worse. So they can never win this debate. How then do we win? Firstly, we win on worker equality because we tell you that firstly we allow people to spot discrepancies between wages between them and other people in their workplace so that they can lobby their employer because it is literally illegal to be paying people differently. We tell you that when they know that they have the same qualifications as someone else and there's still a discrepancy, that is a clear harm that we can prove that they can improve when they lobby their employer. Secondly, we improve unions. They've said that we have no mechanism here. We told you at Ben that we can improve unions' ability to take industrial action or sue employers for not doing stuff like acting illegally with their pay. And also we get more competition between, you can tell which firms are paying differently, so you can lobby your employer to pay you more because the firm across the street is paying more. Their responses were like, the government can do this. We've already told you they're ineffective because it hasn't changed wealth inequality in New Zealand. And that employers will manipulate workers and say you have to take this job because you're on the minimum wage. We tell you that because of that competition, that factor doesn't exist because there's a high supply of these kinds of jobs. We told you that at Tony. And also they told us that only CEOs already have their pay exposed on both sides. So we tell you that maybe the Fonterra CEO, but most CEOs don't, and also all the managers, all the middle women. That's really important. We also get better stuff on tax evasion by allowing journalists to create a backlash that I told you about in my introduction. We actually get public pressure on these kind of corporations when it's very clear to the public that this changes. So we went on tax evasion, we went on worker equality, we save lives, and we actually weigh the very lives of people over this really empty principle of privacy.